Welcome to Singapore Property Talk Law. This is Damien, and I'll be your host for this deep dive.
And I'm Serene.
We're here to get you up to speed on the latest tariffs announced by former President Trump and understand what this means for, well, everyone.
It's been a wild couple of days since the announcement on Wednesday, April 2nd.
Whilst putting it mildly, global markets have been in a frenzy.
Absolutely.
And we've been scouring the news, the BBC News, USA Today, The Guardian, The Straits Times, to give you a clear picture of what's happening.
So let's dive right in, shall we?
Yeah. Let's unpack this whole thing. What exactly did Trump announce? What are these tariffs all about?
Well, the first thing to understand is these aren't just your run-of-the-mill targeted tariffs. Trump has slapped a 10% tariff on everything coming into the U.S.
Wow, everything.
Everything. A blanket tariff. And on top of that, he's imposed what the White House is calling reciprocal tariffs on countries they've labeled as the worst offenders when it comes to trade deficits with the U.S.
Makes sense. So who are these so-called worst offenders, and how much are we talking about here?
Well, China is at the top of the list, facing a hefty 54% import duty, according to the BBC, though there's also mention of a 34% figure, which could be a retaliatory measure.
Okay, so a bit of back and forth already. Gotcha.
Exactly. It's getting complicated. Japan's looking at 24% and the European Union 20%. The idea behind these reciprocal tariffs is to kind of mirror what the U.S. sees as unfair trade practices by these countries.
Tit for tat.
Precisely. Leveling the playing field. Although economists are, debating how effective that'll really be.
Yeah, and probably how damaging too. But it's not just a broad sweep, right? You mentioned specific industries being targeted.
Right. The automotive industry is getting hit particularly hard. A 25% import tax on cars and car parts from overseas.
Oof, that's going to sting.
Yeah, no kidding. It's already in effect, actually. Businesses importing vehicles started paying on Thursday, April 3rd, and taxes on the car parts are going to kick in later, maybe in May or sometime after that.
So this isn't just something on paper. It's happening right now.
Oh yeah, it's very real. And just to be clear, these country-specific tariffs aren't random. The Guardian pointed out that they're calculated based on the trade deficit the U.S. has with each country and the total value of U.S. exports to them.
So there's a method to the madness.
It seems so. A strategic move to address trade imbalances.
And how have the markets reacted to all of this?
Not well. There's been a huge drop across global markets, Asia, Europe, the U.S. It's a bloodbath.
Yeah. U.S. markets are seeing their worst two-day stretch since, 2020.
A lot of people are comparing it to the initial pandemic shock.
The S&P 500, Dow 30, Nasdaq, all down more than 5% by the end of Thursday. According to the BBC, at least.
Exactly. And it's not just fear driving this. There's a very real recalculation happening in terms of corporate earnings. I mean, higher import costs.
That directly impacts profits.
Especially for those companies reliant on global supply chains.
Ouch. Talk about a domino effect.
Right.
So let's break down some of these drops. The FTSE 100 in the UK had its biggest one-day fall since the pandemic began. And then in Asia, the Nikkei 225 in Japan down 2.8%, South Korea's KOSPI down 0.8%.
Oof.
Australia's S&P ASX 200 losing 0.9%.
The Straits Times is calling it a global rout.
Yeah, and the U.S. figures are even worse. The Dow Jones plunged 5.5%, losing over 2,200 points, and entering what's called a correction territory.
Correction territory.
It's like a fancy term for a significant market drop.
Well.
And then the S&P 500, almost 6% down, also in correction territory. And the Nasdaq, even worse, down 5.82%, which pushed it into a bear market.
Bear market. That sounds scary.
It is. It's basically a prolonged period of declining stock prices.
So this is serious stuff.
Extremely serious.
Yeah.
We're talking trillions of dollars wiped off global markets since Wednesday.
Trillions.
One analyst quoted by the BBC estimated the figure at $4.9 trillion.
Mind-boggling. And it's not just the stock market, right?
So it's everything. Oil prices took a nosedive, 7.5%, according to the BBC.
USA Today is reporting it's the lowest level since 2021.
Which makes sense. Fears of a recession. Global demand for oil goes down.
Makes sense.
And here's an interesting one. Gold, usually a safe haven in times of turmoil, initially hit a record high.
But then its price softened.
Yeah, as noted by the Straits Times. So even gold is a bit shaky right now.
It seems like no one is immune.
And then U.S. Treasury yields. They fell as investors sought out safer assets like government bonds.
So a flight to safety is happening.
Exactly. Now, the big question is, how are the countries facing these tariffs reacting?
Well, China's response has been swift and strong. They've announced a retaliatory tariff of 34% on all U.S. goods.
34%, so pretty much matching what they're being hit with.
Yeah, seems that way. And this is going into effect on April 10th, as per the BBC and USA Today.
Okay, so just a few days from now. But it's not just tariffs, right?
Right. They've also added some companies to their unreliable entities list.
What exactly is that?
It's basically a list of companies China sees as acting against their interests, which can lead to, well, various penalties and restrictions.
Sounds like a big deal.
Oh, it is. And on top of that, they've launched an antitrust investigation into DuPont, as reported by USA Today.
So they're hitting back on multiple fronts.
Absolutely. This is not just about tariffs. This is a full-blown trade war brewing.
A trade war.
It's starting to look that way. And China's not the only one reacting.
Yeah, USA Today mentioned that the UK, Australia, and Italy are all discussing the potential economic damage this could cause.
Makes sense. This affects everyone.
Right. And UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer told the BBC that an all-out trade war would be extremely damaging.
Can't really argue with that.
The UK seems to be taking a cautious approach, prioritizing their national interest and avoiding any knee-jerk reactions.
Murph.
But Japan's prime minister wasn't as reserved. He called these tariffs a national crisis.
Wow.
It's a big deal for them. And here in the U.S., California Governor Gavin Newsom has called for exemptions for California-made products from these retaliatory tariffs,
Interesting.
highlighting the importance of California's economy, which is, massive.
Of course. And the Straits Times is reporting that Canada and some European nations are also planning countermeasures.
So everyone is gearing up for a fight.
It's definitely looking that way.
This whole situation has everyone on edge about a potential recession.
It's a legitimate concern.
What are the experts predicting?
Well, JP Morgan has raised the probability of a global recession to 60%, according to the BBC and USA Today.
60%. Yikes.
So, yeah, not good. And Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has acknowledged that these tariffs are significantly larger than expected.
He doesn't mince words.
Not this time.
Yeah.
He's also anticipating higher inflation and slower economic growth because of these tariffs.
So basically, everything gets more expensive and the economy slows down.
In a nutshell, yeah. And here's the kicker. He indicated that the Fed is going to wait and see before making any changes to interest rates.
So no immediate rate cuts to stimulate the economy.
Not yet. They're playing it cautious, waiting for things to settle down.
I guess we'll see how that plays out. But Deutsche Bank is calling this a once-in-a-lifetime event.
They're predicting it could knock off 1 to 1.5% of U.S. economic growth this year.
And they're warning that many countries could face a recession because of this.
So not just the U.S. feeling the heat.
Nope, this is global. One analyst even estimated that U.S. economic growth could slow down to around 1%, with inflation rising to 5%. USA Today reported that.
It's hard to grasp the scale of it all.
It is. But let's bring it down to earth a bit. How are businesses and consumers being impacted by all of this?
Well, businesses are already bracing themselves for massive price hikes.
Yeah, in New Jersey, an appliance store owner told the BBC they're expecting price increases of 30 to 40%.
Ouch.
And they're worried they might have to shut down.
That's heartbreaking.
And remember, those price increases aren't just the 10% tariff. They also include potential retaliatory tariffs.
Increased shipping costs because of trade disruptions.
And the owner still needs to make a profit. Then there are the Kansas farmers who are worried about the rising costs of their equipment, like steel blades they import from Canada.
It's affecting everyone.
Right. They said they expect to pay the bill for these tariffs. And businesses in California, they're bracing for what they're calling astronomical price increases.
The Guardian quoted them using that word.
Astronomical. It really captures the sentiment, right?
Absolutely. And it's impacting different sectors in different ways.
Yeah, like Nintendo. They've actually paused U.S. pre-orders for their new Switch 2 console to figure out how these tariffs are going to impact them.
Smart move. Better to be safe than sorry.
Absolutely. And Apple's stock price has taken a hit because of their large presence in China.
USA Today had that story.
Right. And then there are the auto workers in both the U.S. and Canada who are worried about losing their jobs.
Understandably so.
Stellantis, which owns Jeep, Dodge, Chrysler, has announced temporary production halts in Mexico and Canada, which means layoffs.
And Nissan initially planned to cut production in Tennessee, but then reversed that decision.
Probably because the tariffs are impacting imported vehicles.
Right, it's all connected.
It's a mess. Even the financial markets beyond the stock market are feeling the effects. StubHub, the ticket marketplace, and Klarna, the payments platform. They've both reportedly postponed their plans for initial public offerings.
IPOs.
Yeah, because of all the uncertainty in the market right now.
Makes sense, I guess.
No one wants to launch a new stock in the middle of this chaos.
I wouldn't either.
And it's not just big companies. The Guardian shared a story about a Canadian shopper in New York who returned items to avoid the 25% retaliatory tariff when bringing them back to Canada.
So even individual consumers are feeling the pinch.
Absolutely. And shopkeepers in New York are planning price increases, saying that prices of imported goods like chocolate and Scotch whiskey had already gone up because of previous tariffs.
And they might not go back down even if these new tariffs are lifted.
The ripple effect,
So this is impacting everyone's daily lives.
in one way or another. Now, amidst all of this, how has former President Trump responded?
Well, he's remained defiant. He stated on social media that his policies will never change.
Stubborn as ever.
And he criticized China's retaliation, even declaring, "Only the weak will fail." The BBC quoted him saying that.
Classic Trump.
Later, he suggested that Vietnam was interested in dropping tariffs to zero if they could strike a deal.
So he's still looking for those deals, even amidst all this.
Interesting, right. And the BBC is reporting that some Trump supporters believe these tariffs are needed, despite the short-term pain.
They're hoping it'll bring manufacturing back to the U.S.
But others, particularly Republicans who have elections coming up, might change their tune if the economic pain gets too bad.
So there's some political maneuvering happening in the background.
Oh yeah, always. And on the other side of the aisle, Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer announced plans to introduce legislation to reverse tariffs that increase the cost of groceries or medicine.
Directly challenging Trump's actions.
Exactly. And Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker called these tariffs the biggest tax hike in American history, according to The Guardian.
Strong words.
Yeah, no kidding. And California Senator Alex Padilla expressed worries about the impact on pensions and retirement savings.
So it's not just about the immediate costs, but the long-term effects too.
Right. However, Secretary of State Marco Rubio expressed confidence that the markets would eventually adjust.
USA Today and The Guardian both quoted him on that.
Interesting how different reports are giving different numbers for China's tariffs.
Yeah, 54% and 34%.
It might be due to how they're calculating the tariffs, or maybe it reflects reporting on the initial announcement versus the actual retaliatory measures.
It just highlights how complex this all is,
Absolutely. It's hard to keep track of all the moving parts.
So, Serene, we've covered a lot of ground here. What are your key takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, the immediate impact is clear. Global markets are in turmoil. There's a lot of anxiety about a potential trade war and a recession, and we're already seeing retaliatory actions from major trading partners.
And it's hitting businesses and consumers hard, driving up prices and increasing uncertainty.
Yep.
It's a volatile situation, and the long-term consequences are still unknown.
The situation is changing rapidly, and what we've discussed is just a snapshot based on initial reports.
Right. But this deep dive gives our listeners a solid understanding of what's happening.
Hopefully.
Now, here's a question for our listeners to ponder. How might these global trade shifts ultimately change the economy and your daily life, even in areas that seem unrelated to international trade?
Think about how interconnected the global economy is. How might these changes affect your community?
It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on Singapore Property Talk Law, and stay tuned for more deep dives on the latest global events.
Thanks for listening, everyone.